Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started, so we can take a seat. Anyone who's not seated yet. I see Gareth back there. Hi. There's seats up front as well. So thanks for joining us on this lovely day. The sun came out for us, which is very appropriate, actually, for the conversation we're about to have. My name is Jack Schneider. I'm an assistant curator here at the MCA. And I had the pleasure of organizing the presentation of Lotus L. Kang's Molt, New York, Lethbridge, Los Angeles, Toronto, Chicago, which we are seated beneath now. The installation is the latest iteration of the MCA's Atrium Project series, which invites artists from all points in their careers to respond to the museum's bright two-story atrium space with a new large-scale work. I'd also like to thank the many supporters who make this series possible and make presentations like this possible. And I think we have a slide, yes, with their names. So as we'll discuss, Molt, like much of Lotus's work, responds to its environment and embraces change. So this installation has been on view at the MCA since early April 2023. And those of us who work here and those of us who visit frequently have been able to watch it slowly and subtly change over the last 11 months, which has been really special. Before we dive into the conversation, I'm going to briefly introduce Lotus and our other esteemed guest speaker, Lola Kramer, who's sitting to Lotus's left. Lotus is a New York-based artist known for her sprawling installations and distinctive material repertoire. Her practice is a dialogue with the impermanent and the in-between. Elegantly disordered and richly layered, her site-sensitive works explore the relational bonds between time, personal history, and cultural knowledge. She seeks to disrupt a human-centered perspective of the world with a broad curiosity for life and matter tangled in states of exchange that produce and are reproduced by their environments. Lotus holds an MFA from the Milton Avery School of the Arts at Bard College. In addition to the MCA, Lotus's work has been widely exhibited at institutions including Chisenhale Gallery in London, the Contemporary Art Gallery of Vancouver, the Hessel Museum of Art in New York, Mercer Union Space in Toronto, the New Museum Triennial for their 2021 edition, which was organized by MCA senior curator Jamila James, Sculpture Center, and Reme Modern, to name just a few. She also regularly works with Franz Kafka Gallery in Toronto. So welcome, Lotus. Lola Kramer is a curator and writer who joins us from New York City. She is known for her essays, profiles, and interviews with artists across creative disciplines. As curator in residence at Dung Kunsthal, am I pronouncing that right?
Dung Kunsthal.
Dung Kunsthal. An artist-run project space in New York, she recently produced Nancy Holt Perspectives, which is an exhibition that focused on the moving image artworks of the legendary American artist Nancy Holt. In 2022, she organized Seven Gardens, a public art exhibition designed to connect local public space to the practices of established and emerging artists in the Lower East Side. Kramer's writing has appeared in publications including the Whitney Biennial Catalog, Frieze, Art Basel, Interview, Cura, and Kaleidoscope, as well as numerous artist monographs. She has organized exhibitions, artist conversations, and screenings at institutions like Stadelschule in Frankfurt and the Hessel Museum of Art at Bard College. Kramer received her MA in Curatorial Studies from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College in 2017. So just a couple notes before we start the program. Please silence your phones at this moment. Lotus and Lola will primarily drive the conversation, and I'm going to join them towards the end to answer a couple questions and to facilitate a brief Q&A. So please save your questions for the end of the program. So please join me in welcoming Lotus and Lola.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out on your Saturday. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Jack and Lotus, for the invitation to speak about this work that we're very lucky to be sitting beneath and having this conversation with. And I believe it was installed in April, so it's been hanging here through several seasons now. One of the things that I appreciate most about Lotus's work is that she presents resistance to fixity and certainty. Lotus invites us instead to dwell in a constant state of becoming and perhaps in not knowing. In a material sense, the work presents themes of feedback, entropy, and osmosis. And I wanted to begin by reading something that I found. I was listening to a radio show by Alan Watts, and he touches upon certain themes that are present in the work, themes of becoming and ecological systems. And if you aren't familiar, Alan Watts was born in rural England in 1915. He moved to America in the 30s, and he actually studied theology in Chicago. In 1950, he wrote a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity. He moved to California in 1951 and taught Buddhism at the American Academy of Asian Studies. He became very popular for his public radio talks and wrote a series called Way Beyond the West. He became very involved in the counterculture movement of the 60s and known for his philosophy of integrating the spiritual with the material. So this particular segment is called An Individual in the World. He says, ecology is that aspect of science which deals with the relationship of organisms and their environments. Ecology is the study of the balance of nature, the way in which every living being depends upon innumerable other living beings of all species, and also upon inanimate forces, air, water, temperature, gases, vegetation, all sorts of things. And this is one of the most important sciences that we can possibly study, because we are in a position where we realize that we cannot help interfering with the world. To be alive is to interfere, he says. You must interfere. So how do we relate to this omnipresent ecosystem? How do I relate to it? Watts says, what we think of as I is much more a symbol than it is a reality. The living organism, the whole mind, body, is much more than anything we mean by I. I largely stands for your personality, your role in life, and the very word person comes from the Latin persona, a word originally used for the mask worn by actors in Greco-Roman dramas, which were used to amplify sounds, using a megaphonic mouth to carry the voice in open-air theaters. So when you speak of being a real person, it really means being a genuine fake, because the personality is only a front. What is behind it? Well, of course, the organism is behind it, the whole organism, and we must be careful not to confuse the organism with various symbols that we have for it, because those symbols can be extremely misleading. If we say the organism is the body, what we usually mean by the body is an impoverished meaning. When we speak of my body, that is to say my vehicle, my physical automobile, that is an unenriched meaning of the word body. What you really are as a body, as a living organism, is not some sort of separate existence coated by a skin which divides you from the rest of the world. Shakespeare has King John saying to Hubert, "Within this wall of flesh there is a soul, counts thee her creditor." So within the wall of flesh, the skin is considered as a barrier, when actually, from a biological point of view, the human skin and all skins are osmotic membranes. When you get something by osmosis, by sort of soaking it in, so in the same way, one's skin is a spongy construction of holes, full of communicators and nerve endings, and your skin is simply a vibrating membrane through which the external world flows into you and through you. so that you yourself actually are not so much an entity which moves around in an environment. You are much more like a whirlpool in a stream. And as you know, the whirlpool is constant only in its doing. That is to say, in its whirling. And you can recognize individual whirligigs in a stream, but the water is flowing through them all the time. They are never the same, but for a second, and so it is also with us. Or imagine it another way. Suppose you have a rope. 1 foot of the rope is made of hemp, 1 foot of it is made of cotton, 1 foot of it is made of silk, 1 foot is made of nylon, and so on. Now tie a simple knot in the rope. Now move the knot along the rope, and 1 minute it will be hemp, next cotton, next silk, nylon, and so on. Same knot. It will be recognizable as a continuing knot, as that knot of that rope, but the constitution of it is changing constantly as it moves, and so our constitution is changing constantly. Thank you. I wanted to read that segment from Watts because it is about processes and becoming, and highlights the idea that we are not separate entities from our environment, and that we're all collaborators in an osmotic system that is receptive and responsive to one another. So you are a process, and we are in process, as this work is above us in process. And yeah, I wanted to speak to you about this idea of constant state of becoming. What does that mean to you in this work?
Thank you for sharing that text. So great. You have to send it to me later. Yeah, I guess this constant state of becoming, in relation to what you just shared, in thinking about to be alive is to interfere, in that we don't exist in these like fixed, bounded states that are not accountable to or implicated with other bodies. I was thinking a lot about what Alan Watts was saying in relation to this book called The Web That Has No Weaver. And it's a book that is, it's a Western book, but written as a kind of accessible and not for practitioners necessarily, for acupuncture and Chinese medicine. But it's, in essence, trying to summarize, or trying to kind of like locate the foundations of Chinese medicine. And it, you know, it positions the body as a web, as a series of knots, or this continual kind of tapestry or weaving. And then, you know, the web has no weaver, so it's not you that makes it or another body, but it's a real kind of unknown, or an environmental kind of making and unmaking. So I think a lot about that in relation to what you shared, but also in relation to ideas of becoming and change, is that we're all these, you know, webs that are entangled with each other and the environment. And I think that materially, a lot of the film that I'm working with is highlighting that idea through its unfixed state, through its continual sensitivity. And then another thing about the skin as this osmotic membrane, you know, skin is also an organ that is worn on the outside. So we think of organs as being contained and, you know, viscera as being internal, but it's this interiority turned exterior. And I also refer to these as skins a lot of the time. So there is, yes, it's a permeable membrane, but it's also like wearing your guts on the outside.
Yes, and something to point out is that these colors that you see in the installation and in the the film, they change from like this lavender, violet, blue to different hues of like warm amber and flesh tone and yellow, and they're impressionable. They respond to the light, and as these have been installed for so many seasons, as we were walking up earlier today, Lotus looked through the window and said, I can already see that they've changed since you were here in April.
Yeah, the ones closest to the window, I can see the change. And the colors you refer to, I also have like shorthand names for them. You know, the blue being raw, the pinkish purple being bruise, the reddish brown being blood, and then the yellow being bile. So I'm always thinking about them in terms of their relation to the body and processes of change. But the change that I did see, you know, maybe a lot of people wouldn't see it, but I've been working with this material for so long, so I could tell. And one thing about the change I will say is that it's, you know, it's not my intention to have it be so evident all the time, to be like, this has radically transformed. You know, sometimes the slow transformations are way more radical than the things that are evidenced by our limited human vision on an immediate level. So it's, you know, this is the longest duration that I've worked with the film in, and so it's been interesting to see how much they change and they don't, and where that's evidenced and not.
I wanted to address something else that I think is particular to your work, in that while many other installation artists might refer to an installation as something that is site-specific, Lotus refers to the work as site-sensitive. And I love that it has that sensitive aspect, especially because we're talking about film sensitivity. For you, the work is sensitive to the site, and the site is sensitive to the work, as in the processes of osmosis. The idea that one thing, like the site, is a completely separate entity from the object it engages, as in the work, is antithetical to your values, I believe, as an artist. They're not distinct. They're part of the same process. Each is changed by the other. And I think I've read a text that you wrote where you describe this as non-fixity as a foundational orientation.
Yeah, that the kind of shift towards really understanding the work in terms of site sensitivity or site responsivity is inherently kind of foregrounding relation and co-emergence over these like separate things that can somehow just exist and not touch each other, whether it's physically and literally or at more quantum and energetic levels. But what was your question?
Oh, I was just commenting on site
Yes.
sensitivity rather than site specificity.
Yeah, to me, this idea of site specificity, the language of it seems to foreground this idea that the site is fixed and the work orbits around it. And I like to think of it more as like a fluid exchange. In some situations, it's way more apparent than others. Like, for example, in some of the slides that are going through, there is the first body of work that I made titled Molt was part of a larger solo show in this museum that's housed in this old mansion by the water. So it's a very unconventional gallery space. And I wanted to, there was more in the show, but I brought in some images from this exhibition, and this installation was called Molt. And I feel like it's a very early precursor to this work and some of the work that I've been making more recently, even though I wasn't explicitly thinking about this Molt when I was making these works. It's been more in hindsight that I've understood this as a kind of early work. But this installation took place in the gallery sunroom, which I was interested in as another kind of membrane, like a permeable membrane, not fully inside, not fully outside, very much so a peripheral, kind of marginal in-between space. And on the floor were sheets of film, sheets of silicone, these construction sacks that I sourced in Seoul that acted as weights for the film and the paper and the silicone. And the show was on view for, I think, over 4 months. So it also witnessed at least 2 seasons or shifts between seasons. And the work shifted quite dramatically, but I was really interested in responding to that site and how, you know, the film and the paper that were then harvested after and kept and integrated into future installations then held on to the site in a way that, for me, I know it when I see it. Obviously, a viewer doesn't see it and say, oh, that's Oakville Gallery sunroom, but I'm interested in how spaces and environments, whether it's a museum environment or studio environment or wherever, are constantly kind of being sedimented into the material because they're sensitive. You know, whether it's literally sensitive material or the body as a sensitive form that is always kind of like taking in and sedimenting environments and other bodies.
Can we talk about the extension of your studio as it has occurred in the greenhouse?
Yes.
I feel like that's integral to the development, to use a specific word, of this work, as it has, you know, as it has lived in multiple locations and different iterations. Tell us about how the greenhouse started.
The greenhouse started after a residency I did in Los Angeles in 2022. It was called Horizon Art Foundation, and I was given a very large studio space. It was 5,000 square feet, and it was flooded with natural light. And so, you know, previously I'd been working with a film, kind of tanning it in front of just my studio windows, whether it was 1 or 2 sheets at a time. But in this large studio, I could kind of create layers of film that moved from what I was thinking, you know, in terms of a body, that moved from superficial to deep in relation to like proximity to the window and kind of distance from the window. And then I was thinking of how that was turning my studio at the time into what I called a tanning machine. And then, of course, after that, and some of that film that was tanned in there is included in this installation and has also moved into other installations. And after that experience, I really did feel kind of destroyed in terms of understanding how to work with a smaller studio space. Yes, so here we're at those images. This was also called Molt, so this was the second Molt. And this is where I really started to feel like, you know, this was my studio, it wasn't a show, and the work was actively in process and changing, and I would kind of move the film around every few days, every few weeks, tan the film against each other. I turned the windows into a site of projection as well, sticking like this scrap of silicone against the window, that's the shadow that's coming through there. And a bag, a nylon bag, which is also included in some of the chimes here. But that was where I felt that the work became process, and process was the work. You know, it was really entangled in that way, like knotted together. It's like they are not distinct. And so it really changed my understanding of what I was doing and what I was trying to do, and then it led to, you know, I went back to Toronto where I was living at that time, and I started thinking about how to bring my work into greater intimacy, but also into a more vulnerable and volatile state through its intimacy to the external environment, and this idea of a greenhouse came to mind. And so I built a small greenhouse outside of Toronto on a friend's organic farm. And this greenhouse was called Yellow Sprouts, which was taken after a text that Trinity Minha wrote called Yellow Sprouts, but she herself borrowed that line from a Taoist text that says, I might get it wrong, but it's, nothingness produces white snow, quiescence produces yellow sprouts. And it's this idea, you know, white is kind of thought of as ultimate yin, emptiness, nothingness, stillness. So it's this Taoist or Buddhist notion of really emptying out until there's nothing. And then it produces white snow, which is ultimate yin. And then through that nothingness and quiescence, yellow sprouts occur, meaning the yang energy or the action in life. So it's only through this kind of emptying out that any form or action is generated, which I loved. I didn't know about that poem or the text until well after I made Yellow Sprouts, but I was also like, oh my God, that makes so much sense with what was happening in the greenhouse, which became this extended studio space where I was tanning film. And that became its own, you know, it felt like, yes, a studio, but it also felt like a sculpture and an installation that was really sensitive to the site. It was in the middle of a field of buckwheat, which, you know, has, ancestrally, it was a very significant site. Not that I was actively seeking out that site, it just happened more incidentally, but in my own thinking, in my work around ideas of inheritance and memory, diaspora and migration, my paternal grandmother, after she fled North Korea, she opened up a shop in Seoul for seeds and grains. And so, of course, buckwheat is this very common Korean grain. So those were in conversation there. And the film witnessed this full cycle of like the buckwheat growing up, flowering, being harvested. And so the picture we see now is like at the end of the season. My friend was kind enough to not like plow right beside because it was like pulling up all this dust. But the greenhouse was surrounded by weeds. There were a lot of leaks in the greenhouse. So, you know, the weather was more literally indexed onto the film. And yeah, go on.
Something that this reminds me of is how your work is so engaged in photography, even though you're not a photographer. Actually, when I first met Lotus at a studio visit, I couldn't help but read the work through structuralist filmmaking, which is so, you know, so far from what you're doing. But I think I told you that I saw the film as burning, and it's almost as a structuralist filmmaker would present film as it is deteriorating in front of your eyes, this slow process. And I mentioned specifically Tony Conrad, who created Yellow Movies, I think it was 1973, in which he explored the intersection of film and painting. And to create his Yellow Movies, Conrad painted black rectangular frames in the same proportions as traditional movie screens on large pieces of photographic backdrop paper. He coated the interior of the rectangle with paint he knew would yellow and darken with time, and directed viewers to wait. Thinking about the way this would tan over a period of years and leave a photographic impression, Conrad recalled, I guess, I realized that if I used cheap house paint as an emulsion, people who wanted to be in my Yellow Movies could stand against them for, say, a year or two and leave their trace embedded in them in a monumental way. And so while Lotus is not a filmmaker or a photographer necessarily, I think that you are engaging time, and it is a durational medium that you're working with.
Totally, and the term you used in the studio, which really struck me and stuck with me, and then I copied it and used it in numerous studio visits after that, was images on fire. And I loved this idea of, yes, they're burning, they're volatile and vulnerable and totally raw, but even, fire and burning is not the end of a cycle either, like it's a continuation. And in relation to yellow movies, what Conrad was talking about with people standing in front of it and becoming part of the movie, in some ways it's like that is our physical reality. There's what we now call eDNA or environmental DNA, which is a real thing. We're constantly shedding our DNA into the environment. Again, our DNA is not contained within our bodies. It's not an interior thing. It's not limited to interiority. It's literally being shed. So we're leaving traces of our DNA everywhere.
Molting.
Molting, exactly. And then, of course, taking in the environs around us, which then go on to affect our interior. So it's coming back to what you were sharing about with the Watts quote and everything. But yeah, it's all there.
I was wondering if you could talk about the term regurgitation, actually, because that's a term that you've used before. Much of your work disrupts this human-centered perspective, but there is a practice of like a feedback or like a flow and a mutual flow. Can you speak about that, and what does the term regurgitation mean for you?
I guess regurgitation is, for me, a way to inherently position myself against reiteration or illustration of identity, of theory, of story, of a kind of fact, of linearity. And I guess regurgitation, as an artist and, in your practice, you can't really choose what you do. You can't really choose what kind of work you make, you do, but it's not really something I can't try and be a different kind of artist. So it is, in some ways, an uncontrollable process. And when you think about the process of regurgitation, it's bringing out what cannot be contained. And I think my work, in a lot of ways, is thinking about containing or presenting the uncontainable in a non-legible way. And so regurgitation has been a more like generative framing for me in understanding what process looks like. My sister, who's also an artist, Hannah, she, if I'm ever in a hard spot in the studio, she'll always remind me the work is always ahead of you. And now I say that to students when I'm teaching and stuff, is the work is always ahead of you. And in that way, the work is this regurgitative force that you can only understand, or you maybe can't, you look at a pile of vomit, you're like, I kind of can tell what that is. It's formless, but it's clearly containing something that I took in. And that feels more true to an artistic practice than something where you are, functioning on the same time scale or at the same pace as the work itself.
I'd like to also go back to the fact that this work, Molt, is titled Molt, New York, Lethbridge, Los Angeles, Toronto, Chicago, 2018 to 2023. So can you tell us a bit about its transit so far?
Yeah, and it ends with a dash, just to be extra specific.
Yes.
It ends with a dash to kind of imply its ongoingness. So all those cities represent the places in which the film was tanned. And I went between like being like studio, New York studio dash yellow sprouts dash, and I ended up wanting to move away from that hyper-specificity because again, I'm interested in how the non-specific becomes specific and vice versa. So those all indicate the places roughly chronologically where the film was tanned, including a studio in New York, an exhibition in Lethbridge, which is a city in Alberta, Canada, the studio in Los Angeles, another studio in Toronto, and then, of course, MCA here. So when I with a dash, yeah, with the next. And so when I show the film mostly on its own, except there are sculptures suspended as well, I call the work Molt. Some of the other slides we've been cycling through are of a recent show that I did after this exhibition at Chisenhale Gallery in London, which was a co-commission between Chisenhale Gallery and Contemporary Art Gallery Vancouver. And that show was called In Cascades, and I guess, I mean, materially, there's definitely a relation here. In that show, I called the film and the structure that the film is suspended from In Cascades, and here it's called Molt. But I think this idea of cascades still very much so relates to what's happening here. You know, I was interested in cascades as it refers to bodies of water moving downwards, but also to bring back the Watts, the stream, and the whirls in the stream. But then cascades also refer to biochemical reactions in the body of, you know, these shifts that are kind of moving along a series of events that each shift is affected by the past, and then it carries that, and you know, it continues on and on. So I wanted to bring in that idea, and then in felt important to imply the body and the viewer's body with it. And I think it, you know, I could have also called this In Cascades, but I didn't.
Yeah, it's one of the other things that I find so fascinating about the work is that the body is implied without being specifically represented. It's non-representational, but you feel the body exists. And in tandem with thinking about Tony Conrad and film and photography and durational material, I've also been thinking a lot of Eva Hesse, who was working with a lot of unstable materials and or materials that would change depending on their, you know, the humidity of their environment. And she was very much engaged with representing the body, but without explicitly depicting it. And in all states of entropy. There was one work that I mentioned I've been thinking of in relation to yours, which is her expanded expansion from 1969. And it's these soft draping panels of rubberized cheesecloth with rigid fiberglass and resin poles that extend to form legs. And it was recently shown at the Guggenheim, and both of us, I think, got to see that. But can you speak about that idea of representing the body and doing so without actually depicting it?
Yeah, I think that, you know, I'm more interested in thinking about the things that constitute a body without having the body present, and how that maybe relates to ideas of form and formlessness. And, you know, for the show that came after this one at Chisenhale Gallery, I was doing some research into traditional Korean architectures and traditional Korean homes, which have a lot of more kind of Buddhist spirituality and philosophy at the foundation of mapping out those spaces. And one of the books I was reading really considers that space is created through emptying it out, that, you know, it's not the other way around. You don't fill a space to make it, you empty it out to create space, and then you can fill it. And I think similarly that way in relation to the body is not here, but it's everywhere because of that, you know, and it's and using materials that kind of highlight a sensitivity or offer this kind of visceral, materially oriented affect is a way, for me, a more interesting way to engage the body than representing the thing. And maybe this goes back to the regurgitation question as well, as like more of an interest in fragmentation and hybridity over presenting a kind of finality or a clearly legible form.
Yes, and something I guess that Eva Hesse was also pushing against was minimalism at her time, and I do see minimalist aspects to the work. There is, you know, a seriality of form, and you're really working with the material in its rawness. Is there? But then to that point, you're also including very directly these cast objects that hang as chimes, and so in pushing against that idea of minimalism, there is an aspect of storytelling that comes into the work. So rather than just being a stark installation of material that hangs and is disturbed over time, you also bring in other objects that have to do with memory and, you know, heritage and lineage. And can you speak a bit about how the chimes come in?
Yeah, I think you pointed it out. The chimes are importantly trying to interrupt this kind of desire maybe to take these in as very minimal, beautiful or ethereal or enlightened materials or objects. You know, I'm really trying to, I feel like my work, while it feels, you know, unfamiliar in some ways, I'm interested in how totally raw materials in their kind of off-the-shelf state or in a very not fucked with state, like I haven't done that much to it, how that can produce a sense of defamiliarization.
What do you mean by that?
Like that, you know, the materials are vulnerable and raw, and often in the installations you can see how they're put together and you can clock on a somatic level, not on a head, like thinking level. You can see how it's taken apart and then packed up again. It's not hiding any parts, you know, it's totally exposed in that way, literally and figuratively. And I'm more interested in how that kind of rawness or that level of exposure or presenting a thing as it is can produce a sensation of being unfamiliar or defamiliarized from what it is, rather than trying to disguise it. You know, I mean, disguise is a harsh word to use, but, you know, trying to add things to it that then make it strange. I'm interested in how these things are already strange and sensitive. But within that, I'm also really always wanting to have like an earthly insistence with the work, and I mean that on like a planetary level, like, you know, as our species is actively trying to colonize the moon, I'm not trying to escape, and I think that's what I mean by like the chimes start to push against the tendency of this work to maybe move to an ethereal state or a transcendental state. Like I'm not trying to present that, I'm trying to complicate our ideas of our material earthly existence now, you know, and what that means. So the chimes start doing that in that they interrupt it, and
They have to do with the structure of the lotus also.
Yes, yeah. And the lotus root itself is this, structure that's full of holes, and I'm interested in that again as it relates to lack and form, or lack generating form, and the holes are what give the structure of the root its infrastructural integrity, which was echoed in the material I use for the installations at Chisenhill and Kang, that's also an off-the-shelf material. I didn't fabricate it, I didn't invent it or imagine it. So yeah, while I think a lot about my work in relation to minimalism, I'm interested in interrupting that, and I'm not afraid of bringing in a subjectivity, but also playing with how much I reveal and kind of conceal with that. And yeah, with maybe a lot of people always ask, like, why the lotus root, why these fish? And it's been a hard thing for me to answer. I used to be like, well, I grew up eating it a lot, and that is part of the answer, but I think what I'm understanding now is how, maybe going back to like the work being ahead of you, is that there are certain materials, objects, forms that persist, and then I work with them, and then I understand them. It's not like I'm not reconstructing a memory, I'm understanding the memory from a distance after it's kind of like come out, And I think that some of these forms, like the lotus root, the fish, the bags, the vessels, are part of that kind of process of not reconstruction, but regurgitation, I guess. Yeah, I'm trying to think of another word for it.
I wanted to know how this show came together, actually. Can you speak to that, Jack?
Thank you, Lola. So really, when I was asked to organize a presentation as part of our Atrium Project series, Lotus is the first person who came to mind, like, immediately. And I was thinking about it because this space actually has a lot of limitations because of the light. Museums like the MCA have really strict conservation guidelines when it comes to showing things like textiles, photographs, works on paper. Basically, none of that traditionally can live in a space like this because of all of the light. So I wanted to work with, and I thought Lotus's work would be perfect for this space because rather than having that be a sort of limitation, the natural light, it was actually like a huge opportunity, I think. And I thought of this project in particular. So that's kind of how it came about.
But also, one thing we talked about but didn't kind of really intention is that the atrium is also like an in-between space.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Between the exterior of a museum and its interior. So in that way, it's like echoing that sunroom or the greenhouse, not only through its proximity to natural light and the environment, but as a kind of threshold space.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, like if you think about the whole architectural history of like the curtain wall of windows, that's like the whole point, is like to bring the outside in. So that really makes, yeah. One thing I kind of wanted to unpack a little bit more that I thought was really interesting. When we started working on this project, I'd actually never seen these works in person. I understood that they would change over time. And I think one of the things I asked you, I was like, how fast does this happen? Like, can I watch it happening? And I think initially in my head, I had this expectation of like spectacle or something, of being able to come in, see the work, come in the next day and say like, oh, this is new. There's a new tan mark here. There's something new like here or there. And I thought it was really interesting the way you talked about how actually they kind of like resist this expectation of spectacle in the way that the change is extremely gradual. And Lola mentioned earlier that, I've been seeing this work every day for the last 11 months, more or less. And it has been difficult to sort of notice the change. But I think in talking to you, what I found I've actually ended up finding that much more interesting than a sort of, almost like on a film, when you're watching things change, when you're watching film adjust itself in real time. It exists in a time scale that's sort of divorced from the way that we normally perceive change, right? And I think that's really interesting. And I think it relates to a lot of things. It reminds me of, for example, like Rob Nixon's notion of slow violence, which is that this way that he talks about climate change, essentially, and why it's so difficult to depict climate change and other environmental catastrophes, and why it's so difficult to get people to care about it. And it's because it's a violence that happens via accrual and over time, and the change it's out of step with our ability to perceive it immediately. Yeah, so I don't know, I guess I just thank you for helping me like come to that realization.
No, and thank you for understanding and supporting that. I know people love seeing things change, whether it's watching a movie or a TV show. It's like visually stimulating, but maybe going back to Conrad's yellow movies and thinking about this refusal of visibility, I think I'm much more interested in that. And while, yes, I have seen some of them change, it's beyond the point to me of like that they've changed. It's kind of just highlighting a material reality of everything. And one thing I will say about the change is that what I have noted from my experience working with this material in relation to other materials is the change is mostly evident when you take the thing apart. And so it requires a deconstruction or a removal in order to see what has happened. And I'm interested in that, as also that part is usually less witnessed, but that it requires a kind of willingness to take it apart so that it might become something else.
It's beautiful.
So it again resists this idea of like arriving.
Of spectacle, of like,
Yeah.
I think it's really beautiful. I think we have time for a few questions, right up front, and I think Mike will be brought over to you by my colleague, Akela.
Yeah, amazing work. Congrats. I'm into it. So a few questions, and maybe I didn't catch this at the beginning. So material, are you going to continue playing with film because it captures, reflects, and whatnot, or are you playing with other materials that still are in natural state, do the same? And then also too, with environment, exposing it to the you said outside, but like, let's say to the actual elements or people, right? Like imagine it being a mirror in someone's home, or collectors maybe do that already. And then the last thing I will say, since you guys mentioned the body so many times, there's a book called The Body by Bill Bryson. It's amazing. It shows the vastness and how our bodies are universes. And anyway, very scientific, but yeah, very human. So
Cool, thank you. I appreciate that. The body. There's also The Body Keeps the Score. The Web That Has No Weaver. The Body in Pain. I'm up for all the body titles. Okay, cool. Yeah, I will keep working with the film. It's not the only thing I do, but I think I often pair it with more industrial materials, with sculptures on the floor. Yeah, I'm curious to see where it'll keep going. I'm in the slides, you can see my second greenhouse project, which is being generously housed by Denniston Hill, which is a residency in upstate New York. And instead of that kind of like sharp roof, it's a Quonset form, or like a curved form. And I'm thinking about it, to me it reminds me more of like this intestinal space because of its shape, which made me think of it as a metabolic space, which a greenhouse essentially is, right? But the next thing that I've been doing is, and Lola got to see this, and we promised we wouldn't talk about it in this talk because it just makes things too complicated, but my next project is I've turned a greenhouse into a sculpture, and there's an installation staged within that. So, and there's, a few sheets of film, but it's so marginal in there. So it's definitely part of my, material language, but not limited to that. And then, what was the other question about environment?
Environment, like playing with, again, like elements, exposing to elements, maybe not in the greenhouse, or people. Like
Yes.
people interacting as a mirror or whatever
Yeah.
it might be in some way that might get destroyed or.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, when this film is shown like on a floor level, like when people get to encounter it on a one-to-one, your reflection is there and it's distorted. So it does mirror, again, in a less legible, less true or factual way. And we also talked about mirrors in our visit. So yeah, I'm thinking about that, but we'll see how that turns out.
Collectors ever just do it, over time, what you're saying, it continues to change. So anyway, I would just be curious to see how it evolves with people, if it's constant,
Yeah,
whatever, every day. Thank you.
thank you.
Another question? I think in the middle over here.
Hi. I'm really interested. You had a quote on the screen that says, "An archive won't restore you." And it got me thinking about the role of the witness in your work. So I'm really interested in how, when you repeat this process and your knowledge as a witnesser, if there's an element of control that comes up for you when you repeat this. For example, do you think about how the sun will churn these colors, and do you know that like end result? Yeah.
Thank you for being able to read that slide. This and the other slide that also shows no archive will restore you was, on my studio wall for some number of months. And it's indebted to an author named Julietta Singh, who wrote a book by that title, No Archive Will Restore You. And she talks a lot about the body being full of holes in that as well. And I just loved this idea of an archive. For me and my work, maybe this relates to the regurgitation thing we were talking about. It's not about an origin or a truth or a fact. It's more about truth, which has to do with interiority and memory. And Toni Morrison has this text called "The Site of Memory," where she kind of distinguishes a lot between that in terms of writing fiction and melding fiction and fact together. But for her, the importance of the distinction between fact and truth has to do a lot with how I think of as seeking restoration through an archive or finding your origin versus this kind of regurgitative quality that is both, constructed, invented, but has elements of fact to generate a truth, which has a lot more to do with interiority. So that's her. I mean, I can't take credit for that quote. And then in terms of the control thing, yeah, it's a tricky territory for me because I know how things are going to change now. I know the material really well. But I always try to set up parameters where I don't have that much control, or things end up in a way where I don't have that much control, and I will work with it rather than try and figure out a way around it to make it exacting. And the greenhouse project where I'm tanning the film is inherently very experimental because I'm constantly adding in new variables to be like, oh, well, what will some of the super joist on the floor, how will that affect it or not affect it? Or, I made the mounts longer this time, so similar to here where some of the film is kind of on a longer mount so that they're not quite calibrated or
Offset.
they're offset, exactly. So I did that in the greenhouse, and I, try and allow for some leaks. So while it's impossible to be like, I have no control because I know how to do it and I'm actively using my own agency to determine when I'll go and switch it out and stuff. There are always variables that I kind of have to let go of, and often it's the things that happen where I'm like, oh shoot, that got destroyed, that end up being the most interesting. For example, in my recent greenhouse, there was a ton of rain in upstate New York, and I thought I safeguarded the work by having a drop sheet and having the film kind of elevated off the floor with pieces of metal, but the floor got so wet that it kind of soaked the film from underneath, and which there's some images of exactly right there. And I remember being like, oh no, that's ruined. But it kind of ended up being the best part, and you can't do that from a state of control. That wouldn't occur. So.
Thank you.
And maybe one more question from the audience, if there is one. Anything? One up front.
Thank you for this. It's super interesting. I'm actually curious about how the show is hung and why you decided to keep it up so high, and also why nothing is parallel, and maybe the layering right in there.
It's high because it's
So
a
you
museum.
can't touch it. Yeah. It's high so you can't touch it.
And going back to the lobby being an in-between space, you can't ensure work in the same way. So it's high out of necessity, which ended up being a super interesting experiment for me too, and maybe also like a releasing of a certain kind of control. I'd never seen the work like this until it was up, and I was like, okay, phew, I still am into it. But it was, I didn't know what it would be like or feel like. And then in terms of the formation of the film, I wanted it to have, you know, they're rectangles, they're very linear, and I didn't want to, and then the ceiling is this grid, and I didn't want to just be so aligned with that or obey that so readily, I guess, and maybe this is my use of site responsivity, is I wanted to have, you know, areas where things felt more condensed and where there was also a dispersion happening. So that it's more akin to like energy or movement. You know, in Chinese medicine and acupuncture, qi is like life force. It can't easily be called energy, but qi also has many different ways of moving in and around a body, and two of those are kind of condensing and dispersing. So I was thinking about that in terms of the placement. And then thinking about sight lines where I was like, well, maybe this might produce an interesting tan line over time. You know, the Lotus chime being in front of one of the films means that on a super sunny day, the objects are projected through the film, through a shadow and onto the wall. So yeah, it was really trying to create a more dynamic space where some you can see better than others, and some are much more difficult to kind of witness or see as well.
So I have one last question for both of you, which is just, is there anything coming up that you can tell us about that we can keep an eye out for?
That I can tell you about is my greenhouse as sculpture for a show in Toronto at the Museum of Contemporary Art in the spring. Yeah, it's their like triennial exhibition, and a solo show in Los Angeles in the fall. I'll be showing at Frieze LA with a gallery coming up, and my first solo show in Seoul, which is exciting. And
I hope to organize a fundraiser for the Rima Hort Mann Foundation this summer in New York, and I'm working on an essay about the work of Robin F. Williams, a painter who is going to have a show in April at the Columbus Museum of Art in Ohio. So it's a catalog essay I'm working on, but yeah.
oh, the last thing I'll say that I got excited about, I wasn't and now I am, is I'm gonna start teaching, as I was telling you. I'm teaching a class at Cooper Union where it's like kind of carte blanche. I get to do whatever I want, and I think it relates to this talk because I was kind of like, oh, I don't have the capacity to do this, but I did it in a way where I could continue to think through ideas I'm already thinking about. So I'm excited about that. That's upcoming. But the class is titled Process as Work, What Emerges in Between. So we're thinking about process in terms of artistic practice, and I'm excited for
So
that.
soon enough, there's going to be a bunch of little lotuses running around the art world. Yeah. I think with that, we can close it out. Thank you so much, Lotus and Lola, for joining us, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you both so much. Thank you all.
Thank you.